Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Parenting is a tough gig. We love and adore our children, and yet there are so many aspects of their lives over which we don't have control. Our instinct is to want to protect them from the impacts of failures and their bad choices, all while keeping them physically and mentally healthy. We intellectually know that protecting our children too much isn't good for them either. So how do we navigate these conflicting imperatives? Two of the best books I have recently enjoyed on the topic of parenting come from the brilliant woman interviewed in this episode. Jessica Lahey is the author of The Addiction, Inoculation, and the Gift of Failure. The New York Times Book Review, Publishers Weekly, and many well-regarded thought leaders hold Jessica's work in the highest regard, and for good reason. She has identified and provided user-friendly solutions for much of what modern children and parents face on a daily basis. So listen in as Jess unpacks the parenting tips everyone needs. Jessica Lahey, welcome to Super Psyched.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
I couldn't be more. So I was telling you that I've read both of your books, and I've read a lot of parenting books. My wife is a parenting expert. She's a psychologist as well. And these are at the top tier. These are books I will be giving out to everyone. And they are so jam-packed. I mean, one of them is ostensibly about failure. The other is ostensibly about addiction. And yet you cover so much more. I mean, each book are must-reads. If anyone is a parent and still has an ounce of influence for the outcome of their child's trajectories, these are must-reads. This book covers, oh my God, everything from how to find good friends and what are the criteria people should assign to friendship selection as children. So, I mean, there's just so many things that you cover in these books. Let's get into the writing of a book. You and I both know the hours of putting in the time to write a book represents a huge opportunity cost. It means that if you're going to invest that time to write a good book, you're not going to have that time to do something else. What caused you to say, you know what, I'm going to use my precious hours to write a book on failure? How was that such a salient topic as you saw it?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer. So you get really caught up in that whole, I'd had a book that I'd written, my first book, like most first books, should never, ever be published anyway. So, I sold off pieces of it as essays and stuff like that. But I've always written, always. And, the idea of becoming a published author was that was something I always wanted, didn't really see a path to that. I kept trying. I was chased the same agent for almost 10 years before signing with her. But I had an article I wrote for The Atlantic that went viral in 2013 called Why Parents Need to Let Their Children Fail, because a study came out of Australia. I was able to use that study to talk about some of the things that I couldn't talk about in terms of my own students. So that article went viral, and then that led to the book deal for The Gift of Failure. And it's a great question, because some people get so caught up in, I want to be a published author, that you don't think about, I'm going to have to spend not just the opportunity, lost opportunities and the opportunity costs going into writing a book, but I still do speaking engagements at least 5 times a month for The Gift of Failure. So do I want to spend the time researching the book, writing the book, and then do I want to spend years and years marketing the book? Because I knew I wanted a slow burn book. I was very fortunate that it hit the New York Times bestseller list, but I also knew I wanted a book that would still be selling years out, what Ryan Holiday calls a perennial bestseller. And in fact, one of my friends said, do you want to be known as the Gift of Failure person? And yeah, I did. I think as a teacher, I had a huge investment in making sure that my students were learning and continued to be motivated. But I also have 2 kids, and I was doing a lot of things that I was pissed off at my students' parents for doing to them. So that was really important to me at the time. And I'm very, very proud of that book. But really, when it comes down to it, I think The Addiction Inoculation was sort of the book I was born to write. I think it was the book that makes everything I went through as a child of an alcoholic and as an alcoholic myself, all of that has been sort of in preparation for this book.
Let's talk a bit about failure itself. It's interesting. There seems to be a gap between the way people understand failure and, many people actually understand that there is an upside to failure and that it is, in fact, a cost to doing anything good. And yet, in real time, they have difficulty dealing with it when it shows up in their lives or in their children's lives. Why is there this gap between knowing that failure is necessary and yet, if it's about me or my kids, for some reason, I just can't tolerate it?
Oh, because it sucks. For me, as someone who likes to be right and as someone who likes to look competent, it's a disaster. In fact, right after The Gift of Failure came out, I was asked to write a blog post about failure for Richard Branson, the Virgin airline, blah, blah, blah. I was asked to write a story about one of my failures on his blog because he loves stories of failure. He loves them.
Mm-hmm.
So I told my students, I was teaching at the rehab, and I told my students that I was going to write about the fact that I got this really low grade at the beginning of law school and I was going to quit law school. And they looked at me and they said, that's not what you told us your biggest failure was. And I'm like, yeah, but I can't tell that other story publicly because that's humiliating. And the story that they knew, because I tell my students all kinds of cool stories in order to sort of show them how important it is to make mistakes. The story that I did tell for Richard Branson for his blog was that the first version of The Gift of Failure was just unpublishable. It was terrible. And I was really tempted to just sort of roll up in a ball and go helpless and get a ghostwriter or something. But my editor, what she did was she said, look, she was talking about a ghostwriter and, for helping me with organization and stuff like that. And I said, look, tell me everything that's wrong with it. Tell me everything that needs to change. And then give me a couple of probationary chapters for a whole other reason. The book had to be delayed. I'd had a head injury and it was a bad time. And so she did. She let me have 2 chapters to sort of prove that I could do it. And those 2 led to 4, which led to the whole book, which led to a best-selling book. But for me, it was a total collapse of who I thought I was. I was writing for The Atlantic and the New York Times at that point. Like, I am a writer. Why would I need a ghostwriter? So that feeling of not just like a total collapse of who we think we are as in terms of competent human beings when it's our kids, it's not just about them. It's about how people view us as parents. Like, if my kid fails, that means I have failed as a parent. And I think that's the problem, is when we view our kids as extensions of our own self-worth and accomplishment and performance, then we run into some, it gets really emotional. And I don't want to see my kids struggle. I have an 18 and 23-year-old. And when something happened today with the 18-year-old, it occurred to me to take the fall for the 18-year-old so that he wouldn't get in trouble for something. It was a stupid little thing. It was like a nothing thing. And it was a really good thing. Actually, it was yesterday. It was a really good thing that he had to deal with what he had to deal with. But it actually occurred to me, I'll just take the fall for that. Throw me under the bus.
How easy it is for any of us. My wife and I are both, very, very parenting savvy. And yet when it comes in real time across our dashboard in life, it can be harder, and we're doing our best. And so much of our identity is so wrapped up in so many factors that are actually probably not good for us.
But I think we tend to have a short-term vision of it, as opposed like that self-worth, that vision of ourselves. I think our vision is by nature short-term. So for me, my other constant mantra is, do I want a kid who does this perfectly right now, or do I want a kid who can do this himself next time? And I'm way more proud when he can do it himself next time. I'm way more proud when, 5 years down the road, it sort of all comes full circle. And that moment I didn't step in 5 years before suddenly is this like crowning moment of feelings of self-efficacy and competency and self-advocacy for my kid. We as humans don't tend to think about that long-term reward 5 years down the road or a year down the road. We tend to think of in this moment, I need my kid to do this perfectly, or what will people think of him, or what will people think of me? That kind of thing is just, it's easier for us as humans to ponder that than the possible short-term or long-term rewards out there.
And you're speaking to something that every parent can relate to, and that is that there are a lot of minds in the field of parenting, one of which you kind of alluded to, and that is, it'll be better if I take care of this than let my child work it out for him or herself. When in fact, we know it's really important for them to do it. What are some of the common misguided ideas that parents have around failures, and what could they do instead?
Starting from this really simple, I mean, obviously going back to when kids are toddlers, it's faster if we do it ourselves, right? So just from a survival mode, from a getting through the day mode, it's faster. And that's where, if you've read Gift of Failure, you know that one of the main reasons I wrote the book is that, as pissed off as I was as the parents of my students, my 9-year-old kid couldn't tie his own shoes. And that was 100% learned helplessness. It was faster if I did it. So I did it every time. I mean, that was 100% me. So that's sort of the starting place for a lot of this. And then on top of that, as an educator, I have to say we screw it up too, because then we start learning and becoming and developing skills becomes not about the skill itself, but about the reward for the skill, whether that's grades, points, scores, a trophy, accolades, honors, whatever that thing is, or the love of our parent or the love from our teacher or whatever. So we start to think about these learning moments, not as learning moments in and of themselves, but as a means to some other end. The problem is when we do that, then for the kids anyway, it's no longer about the learning. It's about the grade or the point or the score. And as parents, we shift our focus away from the process and more on the end product. The problem with doing that is that when we have a focus more on the end product and less on the process, then our kids don't believe us when we say things like, oh, that's okay, sweetie. What I really care about is that you learned something from this experience, which then they call BS on that, because what we show them when we hang the report card on the refrigerator, when we FaceTime with grandma over getting on the honor roll, or when we give them a car for staying on the honor roll for the whole time they've been in school, what we're showing them is we really do care about the end product and less about the process. But P.S., do whatever you need to do to get there, which is why we then have trouble with the sort of Carol Dweck fixed mindset stuff, like the higher levels of cheating and more lying, because we need to protect this image of us as smart and high achieving and all that sort of stuff. So when we switch our focus away from the process and onto the product, then we're setting ourselves up for all kinds of problems.
So you are speaking of a really good problem, and that is a good problem, a problem that is, and that is that, parents definitely want to reward the right thing, which is the effort, which is the process. And we do tend to reward the outcome, and there can be a discrepancy and a loss of trust is what you're actually saying would be the end result. Our children will end up trusting us less, which would be really bad because there's a discrepancy between what we're saying and what we're rewarding. How can a parent better reward the process and the effort?
So it's actually really easy, and it sounds absolutely bananas at first, but I promise it'll make sense if you hear me out. You can treat an A and an F the same way. And I'm not saying you have to feel the same way about it emotionally, but you can treat it the same way, which is to look at that end product, the F or the A, and say, oh, interesting. Well, what did you do to get that grade? What are you going to leave behind? And what are you going to take with you for next time? Or if it's a great grade and they want to replicate that end result, great. What worked really well and what didn't? I was really fortunate and got to write the curriculum for a show on Amazon Prime called The Stinky and Dirty Show. And that show is about two characters, like a bulldozer and a dump truck, who think like preschoolers, have a task they have to complete. And of course, their first swing at it is silly. Like if they have to get something heavy up a hill, they're like, okay, well, we'll throw a rope around it. And when the moon rises, we'll throw the rope around the moon and the moon will lift the thing up. And of course, that's not going to work. But when they look at the results of what they've done, they say, oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, the moon thing didn't work, but this rope seems to have promise. We'll hold on to the rope and get rid of that moon aspect of what we tried. And that's over and over again what really good teachers do for kids, what parents do for kids, which is to say, not, oh my gosh, you stink, you're grounded, you got an F, I love you less, which is essentially what we are telling them when we do love in exchange for performance, that whole silent when they get an F and effusive when they get an A kind of thing. But we can get around love in exchange for performance. We can get around the whole emphasis on product instead of process by treating the A and the F the same way, which is to talk about what they did to get that grade. What worked, what didn't work, what to replicate, what to ditch. Take what works, take what is effective and helpful, and leave behind what isn't. And, if you wanted to approach this from a business perspective, go read Tim Harford's book, Adapt. Go read Dan Pink's Drive. Go read the business books about how companies that had a big failure and in the end came out stronger. That's what they do. They look at the problem, figure out what worked and what didn't, ditch what didn't, keep what did, move forward.
I'm thinking about my work as a psychologist, and so much of what I do is going through post-game analyses of what worked and what didn't work, and really just finding ways to alter the course based on historic performance. You also, in your book, describe standing at the front of a classroom and hearing a sound over your head. Lo and behold, it was a mechanical pencil somebody had thrown.
Yeah.
And you did something totally brilliant, which was basically the same type of post-game analysis by reviewing with the thrower, hey, how did you come to the decision to throw the pencil? But
that's the simple version. The first version is this is the kid who drove me bananas.
Okay.
And I love this kid so much, but he drove me bananas. And the kid, I said after class, obviously didn't want to embarrass him during class.
Right.
After class, talk to him and say, why did you throw a pencil at me? And the honest answer when it came down to it was, I don't know, what made you do that? And, this is a middle school kid. This is also a kid who had some attention issues and some impulse control issues. And frankly, what middle school kid doesn't have some impulse control issues? And that's also the magic and the wonder of working with middle school kids. That's why I love them so much. Executive function skills, not quite there. Frontal lobe, not quite attached to those lower areas like the amygdala. They're great reactors, not great planners and resource allocators. So what worked really well for that kid is not for me to freak out, send him to the principal, get him in all kinds of trouble for throwing a pencil at my head, but to realize that there are some cues as to when he's going to have a loss of impulse control and help him tune into his own cues. And if no one's helping them with that, then there's a lot of kids who are just going to be suffering along with their inability, especially someone who can't, doesn't have access to a therapist, doesn't have access to someone who can help them with their executive function development. We've got to help find, this is all part of sort of also what trauma-informed teaching is about. It's not about punishing the thing that happened, but getting at why they're doing the behavior that caused the negative thing to happen. It requires us to number one, understand how adolescent brains work. And number two, to have some patience. And number three, to never act out of emotions, but try to take a breath. And, and that works for parenting too.
Yeah. And I'm kind of tying that phenomenon with the grades and taking a look at what are we going to leave behind and what are you going to take with you as a similar process between the outcome of the grades and the process itself, as well as the outcome of the pencil in the process itself, really making these unconscious motivators conscious. As Carl Jung once said, and I'll paraphrase, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will drive you and you will think it was fate. And virtually everything in your books are about unpacking these unconscious drivers that may occur in our emotional centers. You've mentioned the amygdala, and somehow getting more access to our higher cortical functioning in our prefrontal, for example, and making that part of parenting through our post-game analyses. And I think,
but that's what's so fun about adolescence. I write this in Gift of Failure. It's such a setup. We are asking kids to be capable of more than their brain development is capable of them. I say this to parents all the time. If you're being driven crazy by your adolescent because they can't, allocate resources and plan their time and all that stuff, just look between their eyes and realize that that part of their brain is not yet fully online. And just realize that you may be asking more of them than their brain is capable of delivering in that moment. And that's not to say that in 24 hours, and sometimes I also like to say that, adolescent development is not a beautiful linear slope. It's crazy. It's like the stock market going up and down because executive function skills, it's not one thing. It's a constellation of skills that come and go. If you've ever sat in, we used to have these conferences with all the middle school teachers, and I would be complaining about a kid who's falling apart in English class. And the math teacher's like, oh, that's so weird because everything's going great in math. And then next week, it's like the math teacher's like, I don't know what has happened to this kid. He's falling apart. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Things are going great in English now, because it's not just that they get better every day. It's that they're this constantly evolving thing. And also, I don't think parents realize that that process is not completed until the early to mid 20s. So I'm not saying we lower our expectations for kids at all. I'm saying we maintain really high expectations for kids, but we also have a little bit of insight into how their brains work. And that goes for executive function. That goes for the sleep phase delay, the fact that they go to sleep later and wake up later, the fact that they have lower baseline level of dopamine than little kids and adults. So when they say they're bored, they're not just lacking in imagination. They actually have lower baseline levels of dopamine and are therefore possibly bored. And it's not their fault. So adolescents are so much more fun when you know how they work.
I love that idea of looking between their eyes and recognizing that there is probably, like if we had an fMRI, not a lot of activity going on in that spot. And so when we are frustrated and say to our children, what are you thinking? The answer is they're not in many cases. And maybe their thoughts are ill-formed. I love that you said that. Doesn't mean that we lower our expectations, but we increase our ability to connect events and the consequences of those actions. Yeah. And that's really cool. It also, as you said earlier, increases the trust. I'm going to pivot though. Virtually on every page of the book, I listened to it in audio, but I can only assume that at the clip I was going, virtually every page of the book, there was something highlightable, underlinable that needed to be in italics and put on a card to be read during stressful times. What are some of your favorite tips?
Whenever I do a speaking engagement, I love talking about the big ideas, but people get really miffed if they don't leave there with some actionable items. So the whole making sure that your thought process is oriented more towards process and less on end product, that's usable for me all the time. Like as a writer, as a learner right now, I'm taking a very, very brief break from the amount of hours I spend writing every day, and I'm learning home repair. I've learned drywall mudding, and I'm installing a toilet this evening, and I gutted my bathroom, and I've really screwed some stuff up, but in the end, I'm getting there. Or, as a writer, there are those days when we write, and almost all of it is going to go in the garbage can at some point because but it's not ever wasted time. Exactly. It's not ever. Exactly. I call it tuition, and some of these mistakes are really expensive. Like, I could pay for something that was a total disaster, but that's tuition because I wouldn't have known that this thing was a bad decision unless I did it. So I tend to think of it as tuition. And people ask me all the time, do you regret? Because it took me years to pay off law school. So do you regret that you never? Absolutely not. I'm not a very linear thinker. I wasn't before I went to law school, and now I am. I never would have been led to teaching if I hadn't done the law school thing. I never would have learned as much as I did about juvenile justice and education law. My mentor, all of these things, I try really hard to say, I wish that hadn't happened. I had this conversation about a bad relationship I had when I was a teenager. Realizing that I was being treated badly as a human being was one of the most important relationship and self-awareness lessons I've ever had. So process over product. Do I want this done quickly or perfectly right now? Or do I want a kid who can do it himself next time? That is pretty much a daily thing for me. Like everything from loading something in the dishwasher. Do I want to continue to have to be the one to load this in the dishwasher? Or do I want a kid who it will occur to them to load the things in the dishwasher? And is it a pain for me to say, come back downstairs, even though you've already gone to sleep, and load that in the dishwasher so that you'll remember to load it in the dishwasher next time? That's a pain in the butt for everybody. But it really is fantastic later on when you just notice that it's occurred to this person to do something that they weren't doing before. I mention this a lot. When parents say they really, really, really want their kid to do X, write in a journal or have a daily writing practice or get into Stanford or keep their room clean or whatever. If it's something like that, my answer to them is always why.
Mm-hmm.
For the woman who asked me after an entire presentation of The Gift of Failure, how she could, quote, get her kid to write daily in a journal, I asked why. And she said, because writing is an important part of being a good student. And I'm like, well, you just sat through an entire presentation where I explained to you that you wanting her to write every day is probably going to make her want to write less than, and you forcing her to do it. So that whole sort of, why is it so important to me that my kid's room is clean when I know the research shows that the whole, whether or not a kid's room is clean has no bearing on whether or not their thinking is organized, that sort of thing. And I was a messy kid and I'm now a very, very neat adult. And, all of these sort of, why does it matter to me so much? Is this going to matter in the long run? Does it matter that I'm right? Does it matter that he thinks the way I do? That kind of stuff. So I think those are the big three: process over product. Do I want him to do it perfectly now or be able to do it himself later? And why do I care so much about whether his room is clean, whether he drove this way to get to the grocery store, that way to get to whatever?
And there are about a gazillion times during the book where I found myself laughing, thinking, wow, I'd never heard that before. And yet, oh my God, that made so much sense. One of those things was the perception amongst college students, the perception that other people want to drink and therefore I must conform. But when they were actually given a questionnaire, what was found was people were not that motivated to drink, but their expectation was that all of their friends were. And lo and behold, in secret, not many people really are.
I had no idea. So I almost didn't put a chapter on college in the addiction inoculation because I'm 51. So Animal House. Okay. I'm thinking Animal House, college, they're intertwined. Everyone drinks in college and barfs everywhere in college. So like, why would you even bother? And it turns out that I probably learned more writing the college chapter than in almost any chapter in terms of like just crushing my preconceived notions. So what you're talking about is something called pluralistic ignorance. And there's some really cool research on it that comes out of Princeton University. If you were to ask your college student, how much does your roommate drink? They will wildly overestimate how much their roommate drinks. If you ask your student, how much do other people care about having alcohol at social functions? They will overestimate how much it matters to other people. When you look at the actual data, it matters less to everyone. So a couple of interesting things happen. Generally speaking, and we're talking anytime I talk about gender differences, I'm talking in gross oversimplifications and broad generalizations. Boys will be more likely to raise their level of drinking to conform to what they perceive is the norm that isn't even the norm in terms of amount to drink. Girls will be more likely, if they don't want to drink that much, to withdraw, to socially withdraw. And it also creates a major problem because you can imagine if you go to a college and the college believes that alcohol must be present or people won't come because of this pluralistic ignorance thing, then you're not going to offer non-alcoholic functions. It's this self-perpetuating misunderstanding about how much alcohol means culturally. And the media drives that, and a lot of different things, perceptions drive that. But it was fascinating to me. I learned a ton. And between that and the information I learned about inoculation theory in sociology and inoculation theory, which is if you prepare your kids for a weakened version of the approach with the first drink or the excuses for why they should drink. If your eighth grader, for example, gets offered their first beer because the average age of initiation is somewhere around 13.5. If your eighth grader is offered their first beer and your kid says no, and the other kid says, oh, well, it's no big deal. Everybody does it. And your eighth grader knows that that's not true, that only 24% of eighth graders have had a sip of alcohol before eighth grade. If they've sort of practiced that in their head and they know that, and you've talked about that, and they've sort of have an answer for the weakened version, meaning the pretend version of this approach, then they will be a lot more likely to stand up for themselves or refuse, have the refusal skills needed in the end. The coolest thing about inoculation theory, though, when it comes to high-risk behaviors like drunk driving, sex before you're ready, drinking, all that other stuff, it's generalizable. So if I give my kids really good refusal skills and work on inoculation theory with them around the realities of how many kids are drinking, whether that's in 8th grade or in college. And they're more likely to say no. It generalizes to other high risk behaviors. So they're more likely to say no to getting in the car with a drunk driver. They're more likely to say no if they're not ready to have sex. They're more likely to say no to other high risk behaviors, which is really compelling to me. I mean, it's like, wow, it's killing a lot of birds with one stone.
So that's great. So how can we inoculate our children effectively, both in terms of the rationale as to why perhaps it's not a great idea to engage in certain behaviors and how to actually communicate? You actually came up with pages of brilliant statements, a child could say to.
That was my favorite. That was so much fun because I got to ask kids. That was one of my favorite parts. I asked hundreds of kids. I said, if you're at a party and you don't want to drink or use drugs and someone offers you drink or drugs and you don't want to look like a dork, what are some excuses you could use? 2.5 pages of the coolest excuses that people can give. Oh, everything from, there's the simple ones like it never occurs to us to just kind of say, no, thanks. I mean, that's totally valid. But little funny things like, I'm gluten intolerant. We don't do gluten at my house, and that beer, I can't drink beer because of the wheat issue. I get migraines, and alcohol is a big trigger for migraines. I have a sleep disorder. Alcohol is a huge trigger for sleep disorders. I'm Asian, and I have this Asian flushing disorder that happens when I drink alcohol. It's really, really uncomfortable. It's like a hot flash on steroids. I have a track practice in the morning. My mom drug tests, or my mom breathalyzes. I mean, throw me under the bus anytime you want. But 2.5 pages of really just interesting excuses that are totally valid and allows kids to save face and say no at the same time.
And that's brilliant. And before we can even come up with those well-articulated excuses, the child needs to sign up for the idea that, yeah, I guess this is probably not the future I want. What are some of the things that you have found most compelling to a child, given the fact that they aren't very future-minded in general due to their lack of higher cortical functioning in their executive functions?
I think number one, talking about that. I think one of the most important things we can do is help kids understand how their brains work. And this applies in education, and this applies to the addiction stuff. When I go visit schools, I was in a school a while back where in preschool, they had pictures of the brain, and it wasn't very detailed, but it definitely had the amygdala and it had the prefrontal cortex, and it helped kids understand that if they just want to reach out and smack another kid for bad behavior, that's them acting from their lower brain. And that sometimes we need to take a breath and try to work from our higher brain. I mean, that sort of stuff that's going on with little kids is amazing and powerful for them. So giving kids information about their own brains, helping them understand that when they screw up and can't organize their lives, that's not necessarily their fault. It's an evolving skill, and that won't be completed until their early to mid 20s. So that's huge right there. Helping them understand also that when we talk about drug and alcohol use in adolescence, we're not talking about drug and alcohol use in adults. It is a very different beast in the adolescent brain than in the adult brain, because the adolescent brain is going under major reconstruction, major development. Connections are happening, myelin is being put over, all this stuff that's happening. And there is no backsies if they get out of that zone and want to go back and work on that hippocampus a little bit more. So for example, if your kid is, trying pot and has just started smoking pot, or you think you smell it or whatever it is, I don't care. And you say, what's really interesting is that there's all this research to show that kids who smoke pot on a regular basis, adolescents who smoke pot on a regular basis, have smaller hippocampuses. And it's a part of the brain that is really vital to memory formation and storage and memory processing. And, that the joke about, Cheech and Chong not being able to remember where they put their cup down is not just a joke. It's real, because that's the seed of short-term memory formation. And by the way, all this stuff that really frustrates you that you can't do yet, like organize your stuff and remember deadlines. There's other research that shows that there's thinning in the frontal lobe in kids that smoke a lot of pot. So knowing what I know about you, my beloved child, since I love and know you and understand your goals, and it's really important, by the way, P.S., that we know and love the kids we have and not the kids we wish we had, that if I know my kid, And I know what my kids' goals are. And my kids' goals have something to do with being able to have a memory, being able to do adulting stuff, and being able to trust them with a car or whatever that thing is. That those skills are predicated on really healthy brain development. And let me explain to you the way that drugs and alcohol undermines that. And I know that's why there's scripts in the book, because frankly, as a person who's a real academic who tends to talk in terms of jargon, I have to work really hard to phrase things in a way that other people will find engaging and understanding, especially kids. So that's why there's scripts in there, because I have to be reminded that we have to use language that's going to matter to them, not necessarily to us.
And we have to show them through our words and deeds that we care about what they want for their futures. And they will have our rapt attention.
So the interesting thing is that when I talk to kids, I actually give them my email address and I ask them to email me before I talk to the parents, usually in the evening after they talk to the kids. And I ask them to email me with what it is that they want me to tell their parents that they feel like they're not hearing. And by far, the number one comment I get in various iterations is, I am not my brother. I am not my sister. I am not you when you were my age. I am not your mini me. I am not your do-over. There are a lot of kids out there who feel like their parents think they know their kids, but what they know is an understanding of the kids they wish they had, not the kids they have. And that is devastating to find out. I am as guilty of it as lots of other people are. But our kids feel that way. And so like, if that's the number one thing they're asking me to tell parents, that they don't feel seen, heard, known, loved for who they are and not for some imaginary version of them that we think we're raising, that's important. We are far more likely to be heard by our kids. We're far more likely to be understood by our kids. We're far more likely to be trusted by our kids if we know them, not the version of them they're trying to be that they think we want. And that's really hard to wrap our brains around, but it's like the starting place for parenting is to raise the kid we have, not the kid we wish we had. Because I can't go into a classroom and teach the kids I wish I had as opposed to the kids that are actually there in front of me. I can't walk into like my rehab classroom and say, hi, I'd like to teach 11th grade honors English today because that's how I'm feeling about it. And they're like, yeah, no, I read at a 5th grade level. That's not going to work. I'd be a terrible teacher and I'd be an even worse parent if I was doing it that way.
And I love that you brought up the idea of a parent looking at their child as a do-over. And all we need to do is go to a Little League game on a weekend. A bunch of parents, particularly fathers, are looking at their sons out on the field, seeing their kids as their do-over and getting really, really heated up. And
the joke in education is that parent-teacher conferences, we like to think that there's only 2 people in the room or possibly 3 if the school is smart enough to have student-led parent-teacher conferences. And by the way, every school should have student-led parent-teacher conferences. There's also the version of us when we were in that same grade and possibly being bullied, hurt, whatever. There's the version of our kid that we wish they are. There's like 16 people in that room. And if we could just get on the same page about who we're actually talking about, parent-teacher conferences would go a lot easier.
I want the listeners to know that in spite of the fact that I am aware of these phenomena, I am by no means immune.
Oh my gosh, of course. I do this. Oh my gosh, of course.
So I just want to be really clear to the listener, my gosh, in my default mode, all kinds of thoughts that I would rather.
Both of my books are based on screw-ups. I admit, not only could my 9-year-old not tie his shoes, I put wine on the tongue of my infant right after he was born because it was a delicious bottle of wine. I mean, all of the work that I do, all the journalism I do, all of the books I write are about my own curiosities and the mistakes and errors that I've made along the way. Because as you know, Gift of Failure is about we do the best we can with the information we have. And if we get better information, we pivot in order to be better humans, parents, teachers, whatever that thing is. The reason that I'm parenting an 18-year-old and a 23-year-old differently around alcohol is because I did the best I could with my 23-year-old thinking, if I give my kid sips, he won't go quite as crazy when he turns whatever age and suddenly there's alcohol everywhere. Turns out that research doesn't stand. That doesn't work. What actually works is a clear and consistent message of no, not until it's legal for you / until your brain is done developing. And so my 18-year-old is being raised very differently around alcohol than my 23-year-old is. And he knows it's because I had different information then. I have better information now. And in order to be the best parent I can, I'm going to parent from a place of knowing, as opposed to wanting to be cool in his eyes, or this is easier for me. So yeah, I mean, I've screwed up this stuff all over the place.
Totally. And the repair is just so important, and having the humility. A lot of parents, believe that they shouldn't apologize or they can't show their foibles. And very, very important to be very forthcoming and to engage in a good apology and a good debrief, as well as setting the intentions for the future. So my final question here, so grateful for your time, is if somehow you had the magical abilities to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would assist them in better parenting, what would that insight or skill be?
Did I make someone feel seen, heard, loved, known today? And when it comes to my teaching, when it comes to my parents, my parenting, when it comes to really interacting with people in general, it comes down to making sure that other people feel like we're actually paying attention and seeing them and not some imaginary version of them. I think that applies across everything, the parenting, the education, all the other stuff. And my husband's a physician. That's like one of the most important things he does, is make his patients feel like he's listening and he sees them, not this other statistical version of the patient or whatever, but he's actually seeing and hearing and listening to them. And I think that's what makes us better humans. And that's, I hate to repeat the answer to that question, but that's sort of the thing I try to live by every day, even when I don't come in direct contact, as I often don't during COVID with another person. It's hard to do some days, but I really, really do try.
Well, I certainly hope you felt seen during this interview. I'm just thinking about just how utterly basic and huge it is for us humans to feel seen, to feel known. That is the biggest of all deals. And we don't get taught the basic skills to do that very often. And both of your books really lend themselves to that end goal. So you have succeeded from where I sit in helping that cause. I just want to thank you so much, Jess, for all the work you're doing. And I highly recommend that people either read or listen to both of your books, geek out to your work. I'm just delighted to know you.
Oh, I'm so grateful. I mean, like I said, coolest job in the world, not just getting to write about it, but getting to talk about this stuff all day long. It's like a dream for me. And
I'm going to posit something a little crazy. I think that a lot of people believe they wish to become famous. And I've heard famous people interviewed saying, wow, it was really quite anticlimactic. And I think what they are actually wanting is to be known, even by a group of people. And they erroneously conclude, well, I'll be famous and then I'll be known by a lot of people. And to your point, I think it's just, I just want to be known. And it could even just be by my beloved and my family, or just.
It's the reason that kids who have been through really, really bad stuff in their childhood, that the research shows that if they have one person who really sees, knows, that they can trust, that kind of thing, that their life outcome on many, many different levels, from physical health to mental health, is much better. I mean, the power of just one person. And, I'm very fortunate in that a teacher can often be that one person. And that's why it's such an incredibly powerful profession and such a place of privilege. If your teacher makes your kids feel seen, heard, loved, known, oh my gosh, send some thank you notes or something.
Send thank you notes to your teachers. Send thank you notes to all of your mentors. Send thank you notes rather than eulogies. Let them know while they're alive the effect you've had. Thank you so much, Jess.
You're so welcome.
Awesome. And I can already tell
so
I'm going to want to have you on again someday.
Oh, good. No, when I get the next book done, hopefully we can get that on the schedule.
Right on. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.